It's just past noon at Kent State University in Ohio. An anti-Vietnam War rally is underway, part of a wave of peaceful demonstrations on the nation's college campuses. But not so peaceful on this day at this minute. National Guardsmen turn and fire more than 60 bullets at demonstrators. In just 13 seconds, 4 students are killed, 9 are wounded. The deadly confrontation heard round the world changes our country forever. When Truth Mattered is the compelling story of how a local newspaper, the Akron Beacon-Journal, reported the shootings and the aftermath, creating a truthful narrative that has endured unchanged and unchallenged for 50 years. Author Robert Giles, the managing editor who directed the newspaper's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage, gives an unforgettable first-person account of what took place on the Kent State campus and in his newsroom during that fateful time. Just as important, Giles links the meaning of the Beacon Journal's truth-telling with crucial lessons for all of us today, how to tell what's real in the news and what is not.
Welcome to When Truth Mattered. This is a discussion of the events of May 4th, 1970, 50 years later. My name is Mitch McKenney. I'm an associate professor of journalism and mass communication at Kent State University. With me is Bob Giles, author of When Truth Mattered, a new book with Mission Point Press that reviews that weekend and really the time that followed from the perspective of an editor at the Akron Beacon-Journal. Also with us is John Filo, Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, and the three of us will be discussing when truth mattered and also even how the events might look today if they were to have happened today. And first, I'd like to know where you are and what you're doing. Bob, where are you calling in from?
I'm calling from my condo in Traverse City, Michigan, where we're hunkered down, trying to stay safe and healthy. I've retired to Traverse City after a career of about 40 years in newspaper journalism. My most recent editorship was in Detroit. I was editor and publisher of the Detroit News. And then finally, I was curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. And we came here in 2013, and I spent a lot of time trying to retire, but the compulsion to write this book overtook me. And so here we are.
And Bob was gracious enough to ask me to write the afterword of When Truth Mattered. We actually met years ago at the Nieman Foundation at Harvard, and more recently at an Akron Beacon-Journal reunion. Right. We were both there, not at the same time, in the same era. John, where are you?
Let me see. I'm in my living room in East Windsor, New Jersey, near Princeton, Hightstown. Exit 8 for all their fellow New Jerseyans. I'm still working for the CBS publicity department as a photographer, and I did have a career, 10 years with the AP, and then went to the Inquirer, then the Baltimore Sun, and then, let me see, there was a Sports Illustrated, a Newsweek in there somewhere, and the Courier Post in New Jersey, brought them into color. And then finally ended up here at CBS. It's been a good ride.
Very good. We're glad to have you both here. And Bob, I'd like you to start off, if you would. You've written a passage that makes a good, I think, setup for our discussion today. This is actually included in your book. Could you share that with us now?
This is the prologue. Monday, May 4th, 1970. It is nearly noon. Kent State University students, many of them openly defiant, gather on the Commons, a large grassy space at the crossroads of the campus. The ROTC building nearby is a burned out skeleton, destroyed Saturday night. The protesters, many long-haired hippies, number about 300. Curious onlookers bring the crowd to about 1,500. Ohio's governor, James Rhodes, has declared this protest against the bombings in Cambodia announced by President Nixon the week before illegal under the state's Riot Act. And so National Guardsmen are forming ranks. Their job to stop the protest. The Guardsmen carry M1 rifles, locked and loaded. Gas masks fit snug against their faces, and steel combat helmets sit on their heads. Young Americans dressed for war. The protesters are raucous. They ring the victory bell, a relic donated by the Erie Railroad in 1950. Its clang usually heard after a win by the Golden Flashes football team. Kill the pigs, they yell at the guard. Stick the pigs. The rally is about to start. A Jeep with a guardsman in it moves slowly along the line of demonstrators. A Kent State policeman, flanked by 2 guard riflemen, shouts through a bullhorn, "The rally is illegal. You must disperse." The students defy the warnings with taunts. Relentless, the bell clangs on. Shoulder to shoulder, rifles upright and fixed with bayonets, the guard begins a slow march up the hill towards the demonstrators gathered by the bell. Some guardsmen fired tear gas grenades, and they land with a pop and a hiss like air rushing from a punctured tire. The students gather up the hill. A few pick up canisters and throw them back at the guard. One soldier grabs a canister and hurls it in return. The volley of tear gas envelops the commons in smoke, and the din grows. The noise and commotion seem to underscore mounting tensions. Anger presses in on both sides, unrelenting. The guardsmen, more nervous now, are outnumbered. The students, angry but undeterred, are outgunned. More tear gas fills the air, and there is so much smoke that it looks like a battleground. The advancing guardsmen, guns in front, bayonets gleaming, push the students over the commons and down Blanket Hill into a parking lot on the other side of Taylor Hall, the journalism school, and Prentice Hall, a dormitory, and then against an athletic field fence. And there, for 10 minutes, the protesters and the guard exchange rocks and tear gas. The lines now seem drawn. Guardsmen committed to their mission, students resenting soldiers trespassing on their campus, and then seemingly a lull. The guardsmen reverse themselves and head up Blanket Hill towards the umbrella-shaped pagoda, a square bench made of 4x4 wooden beams and shaded by a concrete umbrella. Some students follow. Their taunts continue. Perhaps, though, a retreat? It is not to be. At 12:24 p.m., the guardsmen nearest the pagoda stop and turn. Their rifles are now pointed in various directions, but primarily at the crowd of protesters. One crouches, points a pistol. They pull their triggers, at least 61 times. Shouts of disbelief, screams of anguish, cries, pandemonium. The bell falls silent, and the grieving begins. So that's the prologue with which I sort of set the scene about what happened on May 4th, 1970 on the Kent State campus. And it is the basis for the story, not only the story of the shooting, the story of how the Akron Beacon Journal created a truthful narrative that has stood the test of time for a half a century.
Bob, you were in charge of assigning and editing. You were that weekend and beyond, I'll say, in charge of the story, but that wasn't necessarily how it was supposed to be.
Well, I was the managing editor of the paper. I was 37 years old, young for someone in that position. My boss, who was an elderly man, probably in his late 50s, had gone off to Israel with a group of local businessmen on a business junket, you could say. And as he left, he approached me and he said, "I'm going to be gone for 2 weeks. You're in charge. Don't screw it up." And so that was my charge as we headed into that weekend. But the background of my involvement is in directing the staff is that there had been a number of unrest demonstrations at Kent State since the mid-1960s. And the Beacon Journal had made its business to cover them thoroughly and in great detail. And so we had a deep knowledge of what was going on, what had gone on, who the leaders were of various protests and demonstrations. And we were well prepared for anything that happened. The weekend began to roll out soon after President Nixon's speech that he was sending American troops into Cambodia. And it played out over the weekend. There was a ruckus downtown in the bars when the police kicked the student drinkers out. They threw beer bottles back at the bars and through bank windows. There was, then the next day in the evening, the students had a rally at the ROTC building, which was an old wooden World War II barracks. They lit it on fire. The Kent police and the university firemen came, but they were intimidated by the students and the anger that they displayed during their demonstration. And they put the fire out initially, but then the students set it off again and cut the hoses, the fire hoses. So the building burned down. And the next day, the students, the governor of Ohio, Governor Rhodes, came to Kent, and he had several missions in mind. First, it was a political mission because he was running for the Republican nomination for governor, or for U.S. Senate, and he wanted to show his base what a tough guy he was against these student demonstrators. So he arrived on campus on Sunday, and he made a speech in which he called the students the worst kind of rot that we have in the United States. He called them worse than the Nazi brown shirts. And then he went into a meeting with the county officials. And one of the things that he dealt with was a request, a very strong request, from the county prosecutor, a man named Ron Kane, who said, "Governor, you have to close the campus now. It's just too dangerous." This was Sunday morning. And you can imagine, if the governor had followed the prosecutor's advice and closed the campus, likely nobody would have been killed on Monday. But he ignored the prosecutor's request by saying, my supporters will say, if I close the campus, you let the radicals win. And that sort of was his what his frame of mind was. And then he turned to the National Guard and he issued a command. There was a rally plan for Monday at noon. And his command to the National Guard commanders was, there will be no assembly of students, peaceful or otherwise. So that was the setting of the stage and creating the environment in which this terrible tragedy could happen.
And that weekend, as you came through it, in terms of staffing, sending photographers, reporters to the campus, a lot of what you just described, we found out later. But your view from the newsroom, was it that Monday is going to be the day? Or my understanding, Monday, it didn't look like daytime was the part you worried about.
Well, there was a lot of tension about what might happen on Monday. Nobody expected violence, but in our spirit of covering the campus, covering demonstrations, whenever they occurred, we had a single reporter and 2 photographers on campus just to record the rally and whatever happened. So we had people on campus, but we didn't anticipate any violence. One of the reporter was a young journalism school graduate named Jeff Sallet. And as a matter of fact, that day was his final day of classes because he was a senior. And our agreement with him as a young stringer for the Beacon Journal was on that day he would become a full-time member of our news staff. Jeff was on the campus and collecting information and talking to people and so on. And as the rally began, demonstration began, and the Guard began to push the students up the Commons towards the journalism school building, Jeff realized that he needed a place to make a phone call. And so he was familiar with the journalism school building. He went into the dean's office, and there he found a woman named Margaret Brown, the secretary to the dean. And he said, Mrs. Brown, hello, can I use your phone? And she said, well, of course. And she handed it to him. He began an open line conversation with his editors in Akron. He was describing for them what had happened. And he needed to go outside to check on the movement of the troops and talk to some people. So he said to Mrs. Brown, would you mind holding the phone open for me? Well, of course. And so this went on, this handoff and this holding the phone went on for quite some time as Jeff went about collecting information, describing the scene he was viewing, and so on. And Mrs. Brown, God bless her, she was a real hero for us. And at one point, the tear gas from the National Guard began to seep through the air conditioning system in the journalism school building. And so she was crying, and under her desk, hanging onto that telephone and keeping the line open for Jeff. So when the shooting started, Jeff ran inside and yelled to the desk, the guard are shooting, kids are down. And that was the first indication we had. And at that moment, back in Akron, we were on a deadline for our second edition of the day. We were an afternoon newspaper. We had 4 editions, 3 home delivered and 1 street sale edition at the end of the day. And we had to hold the presses. And we got into that first edition based on Jeff Sallet's observations that there were students killed. We didn't know how many at that time. And we didn't, of course, know their names or much else, but we knew that there were students down. And then we had a very difficult decision to make because Also on campus that day was a reporter from United Press International, another big wire service. And he was stationed over by the burned out ROTC building. And he heard on the guard telephone, a member of the guard saying, "Send an ambulance up here, we've got 2 dead." And his interpretation of that was 2 of the dead were members of the National Guard. And so that's what went out over the UPI wire. And it was broadcast on radio outlets across Ohio and made the front page of many, many newspapers, including the one in Kent, the Record Courier. Meanwhile, we're holding the press, getting ready to go to have this next edition go. And we needed to make sure that we knew that, as Jeff was telling us, there were 4 dead students, not 2 dead students and 2 guardsmen. So we kept pressing Jeff. Do you know for sure? Do you know for sure? Because we knew that if we were wrong, that it was going to be a terrible story, because then the story would have been supporting the views of those who were angry at the student protesters and could blame them for having started this by shooting and killing 2 guardsmen. Well, that wasn't the case, and we stuck with Jeff, and we made the decision to go with what we had, and it turned out to be the correct story. And other papers who had run the earlier version by UPI, saying that there were 2 guardsmen and 2 students dead, they had to replate and run extra editions later that afternoon
to correct that. And I want to get more into the details of how you verified, who the people were, and also just the a lot of the verification that day and as it went on. I want to back up though and talk to John about sort of the same look at coming in through that weekend and into Monday. You were telling me that you weren't really on campus that weekend, and were there Monday, not expecting that to be to turn to violence as it did. Need your mic.
That's correct. I was there Friday when they buried the Constitution near the Victory Bell. I said, well, okay, that was sort of it was another one of the many events. And I said, well, I've got to get on the road. I have to get to where I needed to be to shoot these things from my final portfolio. It was large format macro photography, putting diopters on the frontal lens, doing close-up work with these huge view cameras. So I left, and I fully expected to be back by Sunday afternoon. Someone else was running the lab. My job was in the lab in the basement of Taylor Hall. And I was sleeping overnight, and I think on Sunday morning I turned on the AM radio in the car just to see what the weather was like and everything. Should I leave early, or is it going to rain, all that stuff. And it said all about all this thing, and I was about 40 miles from Penn State University in the mountains of Pennsylvania. And it said something about the ROTC building, and I'm like, what are they doing in Penn State? What's going on in Penn State? And then I listened to the radio, and then I went, wait a minute, they didn't say Penn, they said Kent State. What the heck happened? And then I'm listening to the radio, and by the time I got back to main campus, I couldn't turn to go. I usually check in at the lab on Sundays, see how everybody's going, because the newspaper office is there for the student paper, the yearbook. The place is sort of, I wouldn't say it went 24 hours, but there was always someone hanging around Taylor Hall. So I wanted to stop in Taylor Hall, but I couldn't even pull in that driveway. I had to go to the front of campus. Of course, I get to the front of campus, and there's the armored personnel carriers, and there's this students playing frisbee with guardsmen, and then I meandered over to the burnout ROTC building, and it had a perimeter around it, and they were guarding these sort of sacred ashes of this old structure, you know, and finally I ran into someone I knew, there was, and I said, what the heck happened? And every time they told me something, it was like, and I felt among the photographers at that time at the school, every time I had a vacation, I was working for a small paper ever since I graduated high school in Western PA. At the Valley Daily News and Dispatch, and every time they told me what happened, this happened on Friday, and then this happened on Saturday, and then the governor came, and then you missed all this, and every time they told me, it was just another heavy, not being their blow of not taking pictures. And so he went, oh my God, and I had 3 other photo roommates, and they were all working for major national publications. They were like, wow, someone's working for U.S. News and World Report. Howard Ruffner, the editor of the thing, was contracted to Time Life. Everybody was working but me. And I missed it. I mean, it was the biggest news event of my, career. And like I said, I've been working since I was 17 or since graduating high school or so. And I remember I had to open up that lab on Monday at 8 a.m. and there was a curfew and you couldn't get on, they got kicked off of campus that Sunday evening. And that was it. I couldn't get back to Taylor Hall until 8 a.m. and on Monday. And of course, you're hearing all the rumors. I mean, I can't find anyone for sure because the Pulse Center for me is Taylor Hall, where the Stater was, where Jeff Salat was, where anybody that was a journalist sort of wandered through Taylor Hall, the yearbook office or the Stater office, and couldn't even get there after eating. And plus, I think they were issuing press pass. I didn't even have those. So what had happened is I opened up the labs on Monday and someone said, you go into the rally at noon, you go, well, what's the big deal? What's going to happen at the noon? Well, we don't like it. A lot of the students were coming in saying, well, you can't walk in groups of larger than 2. There's a curfew at 7 or 7:30. Finals are coming up. You can't go to the library, and which is like the safe place to study. And someone saying, well, there's going to be protests about closing the university, student strike. And I was sort of familiar with student protest. I mean, I'd done some pictures for the Akron Beacon Journal several times, a year earlier, and different, give it to a reporter, they'd take it into the paper, and you get a nice 3-4 column picture sometimes, and you'd be, wow, that's great, and they look good in your journalistic portfolio too. I needed those one day, and so what had happened is I called down there and said, hey, could I get my film back? And I sort of got a gruff answer of I got a lot of film down here. You're going to have to come down and find it, and all this stuff. Went, oh man, I'm sort of working full-time student. It was just, it just became, I just got upset, with it. I said, look, it was, never mind. I didn't even want to get into an argument. Basically, that morning, I was probably the most depressed photographer you could ever find. I mean, everybody was, I was even volunteering. Do people need help processing their film? And everyone said, no, we got to send it out. We got Air Express packages. We're sending our film to the, East Coast, this way, everything. And I'm like, okay. It's like, and I had 2 great professors. First, I had a great dean, Mervyn Perry, who, when I told my parents I didn't think I'd make it as a doctor or a lawyer, in with a portfolio to Dr. Perry, he let me be a lab assistant. And then after I worked a lab assistant for half a year, he let me be a full-time student and a full-time employee. I think it was $1.33 an hour or something like that, back then. And I was able to afford a lot of rice and hot dogs and continue with my education. I had 2, and those 2 professors that were Henry Beck and Charlie Brill, and at different times that morning, because I'd open that lab from 8 until 12. My first break would be at noon. We shut the labs down from 12 to 1. And at different times that morning, both said to me, he said, the story's changed. It's not the burnout of our TC building. It's not the trashing of the town, which you missed. It's student protest in America. They brought some insight and knowledge to me. And I said, okay, I have an hour. I've missed everything else. Why don't I go out and see if I can make a student protest in America photo. That was my self-assignment, working for no one, you know, just a goal, something to do to kill the lunch hour, you know, and this literally is happening outside the doors of where I work. I mean, I didn't have to walk very far. Well, I went out there, and of course, walking back and forth, I was being young. I had the paper I came from produced some really good photographers. And one of them was Eddie Adams, and probably what convinced me to be a photographer was 2 years earlier, he had that picture of General Luan shooting the handcuffed terrorist in the head in Saigon. I think I never saw that photo when it was first published or released. But I did see it in an editorial in Life magazine, you know, and I think I remember staring at that thing for hours in an afternoon and finally convinced myself, get real, go become the photographer. That's when I had my talk with Mark Perry, changed colleges. You know, one thing led to another, and there I was on Monday. Of course, all the lenses were gone. Everybody was using them. That we had a pool of them. Howard Ruffner, who was our editor of the yearbook, was great in that he had every camera and lens that you wanted because he was a veteran from the Air Force and got his stuff overseas at a great rate. And so I think on the Commons there, all I had was a wide-angle lens on a small 35 millimeter. And this was, you know, one of the first shots I made. You know, I was just trying to say, where am I going to be to do this protest in America thing? So I had this incredibly wide-angle lens. It wasn't a super wide-angle lens, but this is the kind of picture I was making. It was the Jeep coming forward saying, you know, this assembly is illegal. Here's one of the many tear gas barrages. I think it was a windy day. I think there were several. I think there were at least 2 barrages where they fired the gas, the students left, and then when the gas blew away, the students, you know, came back to the edge of the Commons there. You see here someone trying to throw it back. Obviously, they can't throw it as far as it can be shot. But if you look, that's Taylor Hall in silhouette up there. That's one of our student reporters. I can't think of his name at the moment because I'm old and senile. But over on the left, you just see. And this was finally, I was going back and forth, and somewhere in between, in the back and forth in the tear gas barrage, I ran into Howard, and I was complaining about having this extreme wide-angle lens. And Howard was kind enough to lend me a 43 to 86 zoom, basically a 2-to-1 zoom normal lens. And so switching lenses, I was able to work the rest of the day. And this picture, it's sort of like the Guard has started their move away from the burnout ROTC building. The gentleman standing there with the folio of books is Bill Schroeder. I had met him earlier, probably when he transferred from the Colorado School of Mines. My best friend was from Lorain, Ohio at the time. And Bill Schroeder was from Lorain, and they knew each other. And I was introduced to Bill in the student union. Didn't recognize him here at the time. What I did is I wanted to, still looking for that student protest in America, I followed as if you jump back one, go back. Yeah, if you see Taylor Hall, there was a smaller group of guardsmen who went over to the left side, and the larger group went to the right side where the more gas is. I followed the group up onto the left side only because there looked like a sergeant or an officer carrying a huge nightstick, and he looked like he meant business. It looked like he was looking for someone to use it on. And I said, I'm going to follow that group up there. Of course, nothing really happened. As the Guard moved, the students gave way. Now you can come back to the, I was still looking for my student protest in America. And then this happened. It's when we came around Taylor Hall. This is where the main body of Guard went. It was this practice football field, the rugby field. And then I was in a position on the embankment and saw this student come down with this black flag and wave it in front of the lines of guardsmen. There were 2 squads of guardsmen pointing their rifles. There's this group in front of us here. And then if you look to the left, there's another group, sort of in a crouching, kneeling position, aiming at more of the students that are dispersed through the parking lot. Well, to me, this is like the best picture I had ever shot. This one right here. This was to me like, oh, there it is. There's my student protest in America. I finally got it. Campuses all over the U.S. are in an uproar. Here it is, student protest being met with an armed, masked, response. I was really happy with that photo. I mean, it was the best. To me, it was, as a journalist, that was one of the best photos into my short career I'd ever taken. Of course, followed the guard as it moved back up over the crest of the hill when they regrouped. To me, it looked like they were headed back to their start point, which was the burnout ROTC building, which they kept the perimeter. They just kept going up. I think I shot a whole sequence of them going up past the, actually it was a bus station. It was referred to as the pagoda, but it was an architecture project. It was sort of a freestanding bus shelter. And it would forever, I think, be referred to as the pagoda. This is what happened. I mean, the guard actually kept going. I would call that, if we look at that pagoda bus shelter, that was the crest of the hill. And from this point, I maybe took another 5 steps forward up the hill. They disappeared from my view into that gully, headed back down towards the commons. And this is after the shooting. This is after they regrouped. There were people wounded behind that metal sculpture. And this is after their firing had stopped. I wanted to get a picture of the guardsmen firing, but there was someone pointing a rifle in my direction. When that rifle went off, it hit that metal sculpture, put a cloud of rust around it, and it took a chunk of bark off of that tree. And I think I was about a little close to where that girl was up the hill, and I backed up a bit to dodge people that were fleeing. Now, I heard a bullet go by, and I obviously saw that one hit the sculpture. So I thought someone had loaded live ammunition. Number one, I saw no reason, since they were at the crest of the hill, to see someone be firing from that position. And then, so I missed the shot of the guards firing. This is the first, I think, frame I took after the firing had stopped. I turned, ran down the hill, and said, "I got to flee." I was sort of a little bit adrenalined up and panicked. And then I said, "Wait a minute, what are you running for now?" When I'd looked over my left shoulder, when I was higher up the hill, saw this body of later identified as Jeffrey Miller. And I said, "Well, I'm not a doctor, but this person is definitely dead, just in the volume of blood in that short a time." And this is when I got to the hill and stopped myself from fleeing. I mean, I was seeing stuff that was really hard to photograph. I mean, there were people trying to hide behind that curb. There were people trying to hide behind those fence posts, from little saplings trying to hide behind a tree. Just little things you just take in a scan. But this was like the first frame I made when I stopped myself from fleeing, and the reaction. And I find this unique in that, well, if you go back to the frame you see way in the corner, hopefully in the right, I can't see it because of where my screen is with you guys, but there should be Mary Vecchio running up on the very right side. It was like, we didn't know who that was until 2 weeks later, but this is important because it came out later, because one of the guardsmen said he was the first one to the body, and I think we used this to prove that he wasn't. And this is her kneeling down. And I find it strange that people are looking for help from in the direction the shots were coming from. I had no idea there were people wounded. I mean, I thought Jeffrey Miller was a considerable distance away to be shot. I was surprised. I was missed somehow. I had no idea that there were people in that parking lot to the left that were killed and wounded. And then if you go, I could see when the woman was near the body, I wanted to get a better angle on it. And so I moved more towards the front, trying to get towards the better angle. And I knew I was running out of film. I mean, I had my student protest in America picture, and then I had the guard going up the hill, but I knew I was running out of frames. So I said, had this debate whether to shoot the picture because she was over the body for a length of time. But you could see something building. I think I made a frame. And I was having this debate as I was trying to get better, closer, and more of a head-on angle, this angle, and moving closer. And I was still moving when this happened, and she let out with the scream. I shot the picture, and I think I shot one more, and then 1.5 frames, and I was out of film. So I had quickly, rewind that roll and then reload a new roll to finish my coverage. Back then, I tried to tell people when I do give a talk about the paranoia of the time, but being a photographer, carrying a camera, and since you really weren't identified with anyone, people looked at you, students looked at you as thought you were working for some law enforcement agency, and the law enforcement or the people taking peace thought you were there for the police brutality photos. So you really were nobody's friend wearing a camera. This is a scene a little later. This is the group that I followed up on the from the Commons. It would be on the left side of Taylor Hall. You see Mary Vecchio there. They're sort of questioning the guardsmen, like what happened, what's going on. If you look up at the metal sculpture, you see where the wounded person was. And if you see that one person standing on the sidewalk there, that's about, I think, where I was when all the, maybe a little further up, all the shooting happened when it was going on. So I was on the right edge of, or the downhill would be the left edge of the guard shooting. This picture bothered me so much with the dead end sign that I really didn't release it until several years later. I released this one, but in the crop version of just the guy pointing the finger at a guardsman. Cropped out the dead end sign. I had some sensitivity to it only because I thought it was a little bit much, the dead end sign. Like I said, a few years later. These are the people that were shot and wounded up around the metal sculpture. The ambulances finally showed up, which seemed like an eternity. And that's why I elected to stay with the body of Jeffrey Miller until it left, because the crowds around the wounded folks were immense. And once again, I had no idea that even beyond the distance that Jeffrey Miller was, were the other 3 students that were killed. It's just unbelievable. I think he was, 120 feet, 220 feet away. He was a good distance away from the actual shooting of the guardsmen. If you look at, there's Mary Vecchio on the right, standing on the embankment. This is just more of the scenes as we're trying to, so I'm trying to figure out. I was taking a lot of heat shooting those bloody pictures of Jeffrey Miller. People screaming in my ear, like, what kind of pig are you, and stuff like that. And I think I finally had a response of, no one's going to believe this happened. And I sort of stayed in this area. And until, like I said, by this time, I think Jeffrey Miller, there were things happening. That body got flipped over by the boot of a National Guardsman. That sergeant with the nightstick flipped his body over. Someone had the decency to put something, covered his face. I think they're trying to do a little more, but that's it. I think there's a picture. I don't know if I included, hopefully, there was, this was the parking lot. This happened to be Donnie's car. Donnie was knew Donnie well. He was our janitor on our floor in Taylor Hall. His windows were shot out, and I think he had a couple bullet holes. May have had a bullet hole or 2 through the doors. That's sort of where his car was, on the floor. That's probably, there were a lot of cars that were moved after, obviously got moved after the shooting. This is time after, and there's still a crowd. And I think pretty soon, this is after the body of Jeffrey Miller is gone. I think there was a giant blood stain left on the asphalt. I think probably in the next frame. I'm trying to remember. No, did I leave out the students with the dipping the blood flag in the blood? Probably did. This was when this group sat down and wanted to know why the guard shot. And of course, we didn't have cell phones back then, but there were transistor radios. And the initial radio report said that 2 guardsmen and 2 students were killed in a shootout. And people were enraged. This group, the anger, everyone knew this was going to be a major cover-up. Everyone felt it, the paranoia of the times, and then you heard that bad reporting, and you went, uh-oh, here we go. And this is active defiance. People are saying, leave. And they're going, no, we're not leaving. And this is probably the most afraid I'd ever been, because this is where we were informed that if you don't leave, the guard is going to shoot again. And this is where you had some fantastic speeches by the professors and the teaching assistants. There's Glenn Frank there. And I think I'm trying to think of the other gentleman's name that I can at the time. And thank goodness while this was going on, and the students were not leaving. This hardcore group was not leaving. And they were thoroughly upset with what they were hearing on the radio, thoroughly upset with what had happened. And finally what had happened is there were either buses or transportation vehicle brought this whole new contingent of guard that sandwiched that group between that group that was protecting the ROTC building. And I think this, gave pause to everyone, and they were able to exit towards the tennis courts off the commons. I mean, the second group of guardsmen, I think, actually prevented another disaster. I mean, being there. Only because there was that doubting Thomas in me. I had to say, did I actually see this bullet slam into the metal sculpture? Did I actually see it go into the tree? And so as I left, because my car was back in the old gravel lot, back by the dorms in that direction from the back of Taylor Hall, I had to come and do a doubting Thomas and look for that bullet hole in the metal sculpture, and there it was. I mean, it was, clean through, and it did go through, and it did hit that tree. It was that simple.
Bob and John, as you were witnessing this, and Bob, as you were getting the reports and preparing that change of editions, we talk about journalism being the first draft of history. It must be hard to get the perspective of, okay, what does this mean? And what now? I mean, John, I'm not even sure if you still remembered who you were working for, or if that was out the window by then.
I was still working for no one. And here's the whole thing. The whole deal of it is like, well, who do I trust? And I trusted, I knew AP people, and Eddie Adams was an AP guy. I said, well, I got to get this to the Associated Press. I trusted them. And then I said, well, where are they? I have no idea where they are. I know they're in Cleveland. I knew the photographer there, Jules, and I didn't see him there that day. I said, well, I'm not going to go to Cleveland. I felt very afraid of Ohio at that time. You want to get paranoid? What made me even more paranoid is I left, as I got into my Volkswagen and drove off. When it was only because after the professors went around and said, don't go back to your classrooms. The campus is closed. Go home, with bullhorns. I mean, they literally walked around saying, it's over. Go away. Come back. No, don't come back. And so as I was driving, and I forget what route that is, towards Ravenna, and I pull out of the park, and get on the road, and I go, and I have to go the whole way around campus, even though my apartment is, I could probably hit a golf ball. I probably couldn't throw it that far, but I could probably hit a golf ball towards the old University High School from Taylor Hall there. I had to drive the whole way around campus. And I'm doing that. I'm looking at a guardsman up on a telephone pole, and I'm watching him literally lop the telephone line down. I mean, not drop it. I mean, cut it and watch it fall to the ground. And I went, oh, this, all right. You have the bad reporting. It hasn't been corrected yet. It's basically saying that there was a shootout, 2 guardsmen and 2 students killed. Now I'm watching the phone lines, being cut. I mean, literally being cut. I mean, it was cable. It wasn't like one line. It was it was a good thick cable. And I just said, oh God, let me get to my apartment. Let me grab some clothes. I think I wrapped the film in a little bag, and it fit nicely in the hood, the curved hood of my Volkswagen on the curl. Jammed it in there. I think I put a piece of tape, packing tape, and closed the hood. And I said, well, if anybody stops me, I'll have my camera bag, and I have some other rolls of film that I'll say, this is the stuff I shot. It really was. Hearing the bad reporting, seeing this phone going down, okay, no. They're going to have to stop what information is coming out of here to keep that story alive. So I drove the back roads, got to the Ohio Turnpike, got to Pennsylvania. And as soon as I got to the first rest stop in Pennsylvania, thinking there was safety in the border for some reason, I called my paper, the Valley Daily News. And the strange part is, I didn't even know the number. It was like, I remember it's like, can I do a, like, I know it's area code, this, and 412. And I said, I need to talk to the Valley Daily News in Trenton, PA. And finally, they got me through. And my boss, my photo boss, answered the phone and said, first thing he said was, hey, did you get any pictures? Just like that. And I went, and if he'd not asked the question, I had to think about it. And I said, I couldn't remember taking pictures. And I said, I think so. I know I started the day with 6 rolls in this pocket and ended the day with 6 rolls in the other pocket, which is the way I work, right to left. And that's as much commitment I'd give them, because I honestly couldn't remember. I remember seeing pictures. I couldn't remember the process of taking the pictures. Only to realize later, as you became a professional, deeper into the profession, it becomes automatic like that. But this is the first time I was actually questioned, did you take a good picture? I went, I think so. So it took me about 2.5 hours to get home. And so we get there, and the first thing they tell me is, we're not hand processing the film anymore. We have this machine that processes the film. And I went, what? Like, I can't hand process this? No, you got to put it through the machine. And I went, no, let's put a lesser roll through, because luckily I'd scratched the roll, Mary Vecchio and Ellen Canfor. And so I knew that stood out among the other 5 rolls or something. So we put a lesser roll through, and I was convinced that it was a safe procedure. And we put the Mary Vecchio roll through, which we didn't know her name at the time. While that was happening, the publisher of the paper showed up and said, and we were starting to make some prints, and the publisher said, well, this is going to be great. We'll use this. I'll give you a big display in the paper tomorrow. And I said, what do you mean tomorrow? It has to go out now. Now. It has to go out now. And he went, well, we're done. We're, it's circulation 35,000. We're done. We're done with the day. It's over. And he was like trying to write a check and everything else. And I said, look, this has to go to the AP. This has to go to the wire services now. There's bad reporting going on. No one's believing what's happened so far. I mean, it's been a few hours and the story hasn't really changed. You're at least on the radio that I could listen to. Everyone's staying with that initial report. And I think finally the compromise I came to was like, how about this? How about we put the name of your paper on the photo and we get it out tonight? And he went, okay. I mean, that was And I felt there was a victory there, you know. So, and after that, my boss was going to, now all of a sudden, my boss felt like I put him in a position of looking bad in front of the publisher. So everyone went home for the evening, and I was left with one other guy and someone. And I said, well, you can schedule it to the AP and move it. And I said, okay. And they told me how to write a caption. And I think our call letters were TAR1. And so every time there was a break, this is analog days. So I don't care what was happening in the world. In the analog days, on a network of black and white, you could only move 120 pictures. Maybe you could push it on a conventional World Series night to 130 or 40. But a heavy news day is 120 pictures. And every time I called, I got this angry guy in New York who said, don't you know what's happened today? Do you know what's going on? We have the Akron Beacon Journal. They're moving pictures. They're on like Akron Beacon Journal number 10 or whatever their call letter was, AK, whatever. And I said, okay. I had to take a back seat. And I was pissed. I was really upset because this is a paper I vowed I'd never give them a picture again, ever. After that run in the fall and in the spring, early spring. And, anyhow, it was an optical bench. And this is 1930s technology. If a caption comes off or it raises a 16th of an inch off the drum, it's out of focus. So either one of the prints wasn't dry, it was wet, had a spot on it, but the Akron Beacon Journal had to recaption, or the caption came off, or something. They had to retransmit the picture. So while they were re-wetting it or recaptioning it, they said, okay, we got this paper in Western PA. This kid will take TAR1 now for the region. And so I did the thing, which was start the engine on the electronic engine, phase the motor, throw the clutch, and I ran out to the newsroom to turn up the K300 to watch the picture build line by line. So I'm doing that, and the picture finally completes in 12 minutes or something like that. And I turn up the volume on the receiver in the newsroom, and you just hear that white noise of the network. It was like, shh, like, okay. And I'm thinking, I screwed up. I think I just sent it to the newsroom, not to because you could do that if you threw the right switch. And I finally, it seemed like an eternity. Someone said, hey, that's not a bad picture. You have any more? And I said, yeah, I have like 2 or 3 more, 3 or 4 more. So then that's how I finished the evening, and then tried to write a first person account. And then I think I remember, but the funniest part, dwelling back to the paranoia, I think I stayed up most of the night because I'm not a writer, right? That's why I'm in photography. And, writing a first person, and I had some good friends that were helping me with the correct English and everything. I finally think I got to bed about 3 or 4 in the morning in my house, only to be awakened by my mother about 7, 8 or 9 in the morning. I think it was around 9 in the morning. And she said, well, there's a couple of guys downstairs, and I gave them cake and coffee. They want to talk to you. And I said, oh, who are they? Were they from some newspaper station? You go, no, they're the FBI. They're the FBI. So it was like, okay, it's not even 24 hours yet, and I've got the FBI in my house, and of course they're asking for the film, and of course I didn't give it to them and didn't have it, and I wouldn't have given it to them even if I did have it. But it was like, oh, we'd like to have everything, and I said, well, glad to make you prints. Here's what they cost, whatever, and stuff like that. So that's how that went. I tried to explain that to people, and yeah, it was pretty strange. Mom took care of him with cake and coffee.
It's great.
Well, I gave I must have talked for several hours, what happened, what I saw happen. So, and actually that came back to haunt me, because from my position coming up the hill, as the guard was crouching over to shoot downhill, it appeared from where I stood that they were on one knee, but they really weren't. They were just with a downhill leg. And so when the trials came years later, it's like, well, you said that they were on one knee and there's photographic evidence they weren't. I go, yeah, that's what it looked like from where I was.
Fake news.
Fake news, exactly.
Bob, I want to come back to you because that afternoon you were fighting off a lot of incorrect information, and in fact, how to even verify the names and things you have. Your book goes into it in some wonderful detail. How do you get the first draft of history right, or how do you get all the drafts right?
Well, first thing you have to be able to do is to hold back any story that you can't verify. And so we were really in that process, and we were on the deadline, and we were trying to decide between the UPI version with 2 guardsmen dead and our own reporter's version with 4 students dead. We held the press as long as we could, and the foreman of the press room was yelling at us, I got to start the press, so on. And so I had to make the decision. And the state editor, Pat Engelhardt, turned to me and he said, okay, what should we do? And I said, we go with Jeff Story. He's our guy. He was there. He witnessed it. Let's do it. So that was one important decision that we had to make. And then we did need to identify the students because the bodies were taken off by ambulance very, very quickly. And we knew that they were likely to have been taken to Ravenna, the Ravenna Memorial Hospital in Ravenna, neighboring Ravenna. And so there was one reporter left in the newsroom, Bob Page. And they said, Pat Engelhardt, the state editor, said, Page, get going and get over there and get us the names. We have to have them in time for the last edition. So Page, who had a Volkswagen too, he putted along and he got to Robinson Memorial Hospital, and the doors were blockaded by some security guards. And then there was a ruckus because some of the students had come out to the hospital and they didn't like the fact that they were being prevented by the security people from going in to check on friends, family, whatever. And there was a ruckus. And so Page saw the ruckus and saw that the doors were unguarded, and he went in the hospital. And he started to walk around, and a nurse came up to him and said, can I help you? And he identified himself as Bob Page from the Beacon Journal, and apparently she had had some good experiences with the piece, trusted the paper. So she said, come with me. And so she took him, and he went into a couple of rooms, and he met a doctor who was working had the bodies there, and the 4 were covered with sheets. And he gave him a brief description, but he didn't know the names. And so the question then was, how is the hospital going to handle this information? And the local congressman, a guy named William Stanton, came in, and he sort of took control himself and said, I'll take care of the public relations. I'll protect the hospital and so on. So he waited for a while, and pretty soon Bob Page noticed that he had a sheet of paper in his hand that he was holding down by his side. And another reporter from the Beacon Journal, Tim Smith, was on your faculty, came, and the 2 of them played sort of tag. And Tim, who knew the congressman, started talking to him, and Bob Page was able to read the names on the sheet of paper that he was holding. And so he got by the time the deadline was approaching, about 4 o'clock, and he got all the names, and they phoned him in, and we made the 4:30 night final edition. That was the last edition of the day. And the Stanton never had a press briefing until 7 o'clock. So we would have totally missed it if we had depended on the congressman for the information about the names and the hometowns of the victims. So that was how we got the identification of the victims. And then, so what the picture that you're now seeing is the second edition. The first edition of the day went to, goes to the suburban towns. And then the second edition, which had just a bulletin that said there had been shootings at Kent State and so on. And then this one you just showed me, this was the main home delivery edition that went to this one, had 4 protesters shot. We were able to get the fact that there were 4 protesters shot. This is the good work of Jeff Sallet that enabled us to go to press at 2:30 with this new information that 4 students, protesters, had been shot. And then by the time our crew went out to Ravenna Hospital, we got to the final edition with the heavy block headline. Can you put that up?
Yeah, here it is.
This one, this is the final, it's the market edition. This is where the stock market prices were. And 4 dead and 11 wounded. Now, the 2 of the wounded turned out to be National Guard soldiers. One had a hypertension and the other fainted. And apparently they were initially counted among the wounded, but in fact, among the students, there were 9 wounded and of course the 4. So we were able to get all this information, including the names, into the last edition of the day on May the 4th, and we were the only news organization that accomplished that. Now, I should tell you one other thing. Of course, while we were hustling to get our editions of May 4th completed and with the full story as we could get it, we had to plan for the next day, May the 5th, and we added 8 pages to the paper, 8 open pages, and we began to send reporters out to the campus. Now, the campus had been closed, and as it turned out, Mrs. Margaret Brown was still hanging onto that telephone, and as it turned out, all of the lines to Kent had crashed. Now, I don't know whether John Filo saw them, the National Guard, cutting the lines.
I think I know why.
He did, and so that was part of it. But the whole system crashed. And so we had to find a way to get communication from the campus to our newsroom. And we were able to, we had a good contact over at Ohio Bell. And he loaned us a phone car. You can imagine in 1970, there weren't many phone cars around. But we were able to get it. And so Ron Clark, the city editor, drove out to Kent and set up a city desk right on the edge of the Commons. And as reporters were being sent from all kinds of places to the campus, they reported to Ron Clark, and the assignments went out. And so we again had because of our planning and our good contacts and people trusting us, we were able to get a head start on preparing the story for the next day. And then we began to roll out a series of exclusive stories. Several of them were about decisions the governor had made to not close the campus, and the speeches he made, his orders to the National Guard that there would be no rallies allowed. And so the overall context of how the governor came out was that we held him as accountable as was possible at that moment. And we were able to interview some of the guardsmen who said to us, I didn't feel like I was threatened. I didn't feel that my life was in danger as the guard commanders insisted. And then there was a story about the bullet hole in the sculpture that John pointed out. And the bullet hole looked to us like, well, the guard was claiming it was a sniper bullet. It looked to us like it was something different, that it came from a different direction. And so we did a test with some bullets and some pieces of metal similar to the sculpture. And we demonstrated that there was no sniper because of the direction the bullet came from. And then, so we kept reporting the story, and yeah, there it is. And you can see the smooth hole is where the bullet came out, and the furry hole is where the bullet went in. And that was exactly the opposite of what most observers thought. So we were able to get the guard to sort of set aside this phony claim that there had been a sniper. And then part of our reporting had to do with tracking the legal cases as they went along. And one of the things that we really tried to establish was the responsibility and the accountability of the guard commanders, because they didn't carry out their command responsibilities in the way they should have, and then they wouldn't take responsibility for it. And we tried to find out, and my book reports on, why the guard commander was not court-martialed for failure to dereliction of duty and failure to carry out his responsibilities. And of course, it turns out that the National Guard was not assigned to Kent State by the president, which would have made a federal institution, a federal organization, and was subject to the military code of ethics. But instead, it was by the state of Ohio, and because it was under Governor Rhodes, they had to be tried in the court system, which they did, and there was no conviction. But the real blockbuster story that made a difference in our coverage and in the public sense of what had happened came in the middle of July. John talks about the FBI agents who knocked on his door the following morning. Well, there were FBI agents all over the campus. The Justice Department had sent 100 agents to investigate the shooting. And they were preparing a report for an FBI, for a grand jury investigation that was going to take place in the fall hearing. And in the middle of July, a reporter in Ravenna, who covered the courts and police and so on, Ray Redmond, was in the prosecutor's office. This was a prosecutor that had tried to get the governor to close the campus. The prosecutor handed Ray Redmond a sheaf of papers, 14 pages, and said, "You can read this, but you can't have it." And what he gave him was a summary of the FBI's findings on the Kent State shootings. And the FBI had said in its finding there was no need for the students to be shot. The FBI or the National Guard was not under death threat or not going to be fatally harmed by the students. And there were many other ways to control the demonstration. And so that was a blockbuster story. Went all over the country. President Nixon wanted it killed. Of course, he couldn't do that because the story was out. And it helped frame a public understanding of the public narrative that sort of has guided the truth of this story over the years, that students died in vain, the guardsmen were poorly led, the governor made a lot of mistakes, that the students did misbehave, but they certainly didn't deserve to be shot.
Bob, I was always curious, did you, meaning you, the newspaper, receive a lot of hate mail from across the nation for your reporting?
We did. We get an extraordinary number of angry letters, and we opened up the paper on many days just to fill them with letters, and many of the letters were very critical of us. In fact, somebody on your faculty did a bit of research and concluded that most of the letters praising the newspaper came from the Kent State community, and most of those being critical came from the community at large. I mean, Kent City and the surrounding rural areas were very conservative, and they didn't like the change in the culture that the new generation of protesting students represented, their dress, their behavior, and other elements that went into shaping the public opinion of what was acceptable in their minds and what was not. So when we published the FBI story, a lot of people were just furious at the newspaper. And many of them called and said, I want to cancel my paper. And by the way, how dare you criticize the National Guard or criticize the governor? It was just it was a very vigorous response. And we stuck by our story, and it turned out to be the one.
Well, about a year later, I believe both of you heard about a Pulitzer Prize, both for the Beacon Journal and John for your work related to May 4th, 1970. As you look back today, 50 years later, what do you see that would be different? I mean, there's some obvious things, but if this were being reported now?
Well, in my book, I asked the question, if Kent State happened tomorrow, what would the coverage look like? And of course, it would be driven by social media. We would have had iPhones and all the various platforms, social platforms. It would have been an instant story. There would have been many pictures, many snapshots, selfies taken during the shooting where the guard was marching around trying to chase the students throughout the whole thing. And some people would have been obviously used it for different purposes. Over time, people would have used the various social media output to frame a point of view and use what evidence they had seen or evidence that they had shot in their iPhones to argue that there were communists among the students, which was a familiar refrain, or other things. And it would take the mainstream media to come along later, not many days later, but doing their professional job to investigate and then frame the facts, in a truthful way, as we did. That would have finally built a public understanding. But we were under pressure from the White House, the Justice Department, the FBI, the Governor's Office, the commanders of the National Guard, people and citizens and communities who were supportive of the Vietnam War, and others who were opposed to the kind of journalism we were doing. So it was a challenge for many of these reporters were quite young. Many of them had graduated from Kent State, and to keep them focused on their job of gathering facts, interviewing the right people, knowing the right people to ask questions of, and being sure that our stories were very carefully edited, and we didn't publish anything unless we could verify it, validate it.
John, what comes to mind when you think of that question?
Well, I think Bob hit the nail on the head. I mean, when I was a journalist and working in journalism and working with the Eddie Adams Workshop, once again, you asked a year later what had happened, and it was really hard for me because I was still at school trying to complete and get finished for that year. Well, of course, I changed majors also. But there was an AP teletype machine right there in Taylor Hall, not too far from Mrs. Brown's office or the lab where I worked. And so the first information I have is over the AP teletype. It can't be 100 yards from where or 200 yards from where I took the picture. I mean, that's strange in itself. And I think I felt really, really special for about 48 hours until I got a letter in the mail from Eddie Adams that said, "Congratulations, let's see what you can do tomorrow." And it sort of brought me way back down. And I thanked him to this day for that. It would have been, giant crazy. I had a lot to learn.
Well, gentlemen, the chimes, I think, are telling us that it's about time for us to wrap up. We could go on with a lot of questions. This has really been wonderful.
Thanks very much, Mitch.
Yes,
Yeah.
and just really appreciate you gathering and just having a chance to talk about this together. And When Truth Mattered, Bob, I think you nailed it for the name of the book. It does matter. It does matter that people have, they know the communities they're in, they cover them, they know who the people are, and then know who to talk to when something happens, and know how to find the right answers, not just the first ones they're given.
Well, the truth matters a great deal today, as you recognize, as we're struggling to find out the meaning of the virus that's caused this pandemic, and the recognizing how important it is for journalists to be able to find and interview and depend on the experts, people, trained scientists and trained medical people who can speak with authority and can ignore other kinds of information that obviously is not true. That's a critical thing, and it's a way of thinking about what's going on today and comparing it to what happened in 1970. And there is a real parallel now for people to think about as they try to decide who in the press can I trust, which newspapers can I trust, and how much I need a good local newspaper which can tell me what's going on in my community, in my local hospital.
That's right. Well, we had hoped to have this in front of an audience and people able to engage with us and ask questions. And unfortunately, we are separated and in our own homes. So I think we can just conclude with my thanks, and just grateful that we can at least get this on a recording, so folks can really look back and really value truth. And John, even as you defended it by running across the border just to make sure that no one tampered with it, with the film rolled up. I didn't know this part under the hood of your Volkswagen Bug.
I was afraid. I had no bones about that. I mean, you see too many. Number one is bad reporting, and then seeing a few items. It's like, no, I can't trust it that I will get there with it. I have to make sure.
Can you believe this was 50 years ago?
That's a long time.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, both.
Okay, thanks, John.
All right.
Thank you,
All right.
Robert. Thank
Take
you
care.
very much. Really appreciate being part of this. Thank you so much.
Thank
You're
you.
very welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye.